Support comes from Gemma, architects, planners, and designers seeking to bring joy to their clients and communities. Details at JEMASTL.com.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Merzenbaum. I want to introduce you to Crystal Lyon. She's a Forestdale resident and the mother of a delightful 18-month-old baby named Ari. Both Lyon and her daughter have recently been on Medicaid, a program that helps connect low-income workers, people with disabilities, and older adults to healthcare services. Lyon says Medicaid wasn't just helpful for her daughter, it saved her life. Shortly after Ari was born, doctors diagnosed her with a rare form of eye cancer. Thanks to Medicaid paying for much of the treatments, Lyon was able to access some of the leading eye doctors in the St. Louis region.
They took such great care of my daughter. And even now, when we go to the specialty care centers for her eye exams, they sing to her and they let her bring her stuffies back. And every time they bring her little Elmo stuffy back, he always has an eye patch on like she does. And it's just, they're amazing.
Ari, by the way, is doing much better now. But it probably won't surprise you that Lyon closely followed the legislative trajectory of what lawmakers dubbed the One Big Beautiful Bill. Now it's more accurate to call it the One Big Beautiful Law, since President Donald Trump signed it on July 4th. There are so many different provisions in this law that it's unclear how it will affect Lyon or her family right away. But she's deeply concerned about how two controversial components could affect roughly 1.2 million Missourians on Medicaid. One would require some recipients to either work or try to find employment. The other would sharply limit a tax on medical providers, such as hospitals, that Missouri and other states use to help pay for the program. Lyon worries that other Missourians won't have the financial peace of mind she had when her daughter was going through the most difficult parts of her illness.
So I think instead of cutting Medicaid, we need to put more money into it. There is kids like my daughter who are at the end of their life and their parents, I've seen it happen. They have to sit there and hold their kid's hand and tell them that it's okay to go and tell them to shut their eyes and that they love them. And then on top of it, they have to deal with medical bills. And I don't think that any parent who has gone through such a trying journey should have to pay medical bills while also paying for a funeral and burying their little kid. I think that that's just awful.
Healthcare experts and practitioners warn that the Big Beautiful Bill's Medicaid changes will result in fewer people having access to the program and a financial hollowing out of struggling hospitals in rural Missouri.
We're not the smallest of the smalls. We're not the biggest of the bigs. We're kind of right in the middle.
That's Craig Thompson, the president and CEO of Golden Valley Memorial Healthcare. Thompson's healthcare system is based in Clinton, Missouri, about 75 miles southeast of Kansas City, and it serves about 80,000 people in rural counties, which include a lot of Medicaid and Medicare recipients. Leaders of Missouri hospitals have embraced medical provider taxes for years. They contend that it allows Missouri to have a financially solvent Medicaid program, which in turn means that hospitals will get compensated enough by the state to provide care for enrollees. The Big Beautiful Bill would cap medical provider taxes at 3.5% by 2032. For context, Missouri's medical provider tax is currently at 4.2%, but has gone as high as close to 6%. And healthcare experts worry that the shortfall caused by this cap will prompt state lawmakers to either spend less money on education or pay places like hospitals less money to care for Medicaid patients. Thompson says that working people have a lot to lose if the Big Beautiful Bill ends up hurting the financial viability of rural hospitals.
One of the things that I do hope comes from all this deliberation around Medicaid and this discussion is that we put a face to the Medicaid program. There's this perception, and it's misplaced, that Medicaid beneficiaries are despondent, lazy, people who are just out taking advantage of the government. Well, I can tell you in the rural community that I serve, that is not the case. Medicaid recipients are farmers, they're ranchers, they're small business owners, they're veterans, and it's a whole bunch of kids. And to think that those individuals want to be on Medicaid, that is not the case. But for many, Medicaid is the resource they have to access healthcare services.
Ultimately, the federal budgetary package included $50 billion to help hospital systems like Golden Valley Memorial Healthcare. But whether that's enough to offset the loss of state revenue when the medical provider restrictions go into effect is still an open question. While Republicans disagreed greatly over whether to curb medical provider taxes, GOP lawmakers were far more united on requiring Medicaid recipients to prove they're working, in school, or doing community service. Here's Missouri Congressman Jason Smith of Salem.
It's about restoring sanity in a town that's lost it, cutting waste and reining in reckless spending. It demands that if you're able to work, you should. It stops asking working families to foot the bill for Washington's bad decisions.
States like Missouri will have a couple of years to figure out how the work requirements will, work. But Heidi Lucas isn't optimistic that they'll be intuitive for Missourians who need Medicaid. Lucas is with the Missouri Rural Healthcare Association, and in the past, Lucas was a caseworker who signed people up for temporary assistance for needy families, another federal aid program that's run by states which does have a work requirement.
For them to fulfill what the work requirements required was next to impossible. So, you live in a small town, how many places are there for you to actually apply for? And what are those requirements going to be? How many places do you have to apply for in a week, in a month? We don't know all of those details yet, but there's only so many places for people to apply for. So what happens when you exhaust all of those? These are people, they want to work. Folks who aren't working, they want to work. They want to provide a better living for their family.
Getting the big, beautiful bill to Trump wasn't easy, as it passed in both the Senate and the House by very narrow margins. North Carolina Senator Tom Tillis joined two other GOP senators in voting no, primarily because of fears that the Medicaid provisions could plunge states into financial and administrative uncertainty.
We owe it to the states to do the work to understand how these proposals affect them. How hard is that? I did it.
For a time, it appeared that Missouri Senator Josh Hawley could have been a no vote. He penned an op-ed for the New York Times calling efforts to cut Medicaid, quote, morally wrong and politically suicidal. He also talked with reporters about it in March at an annual gathering of Missouri Republicans.
I'm not going to vote for Medicaid benefit cuts. Now, they want to do work requirements. I'm all for that. I think that's fantastic. But I'm not going to vote for something that ends up cutting benefits for people who are working and who qualify for Medicaid. 21% of Missouri families are either on Medicaid or CHIP. And we're talking about 1.5 million people. So I'm just not going to do that. And I've made that very clear. If they want to do that, they can do that without my vote.
Hawley ended up voting yes on the bill, and that prompted some commentators, especially on the political left, to paint Hawley as a flimsy paper tiger who doesn't back up his grand pronouncements with action. But at a press conference in Hazelwood this week celebrating the revival and expansion of the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, Hawley noted that the medical provider tax curbs, which could prompt states to scale back Medicaid coverage, don't go fully into effect until 2032.
So there's a lot of work to do on this. I think it's a mistake to cut Medicaid. I've always said that. I continue to believe it. We have prevented it from happening in Missouri for the rest of this decade and, in fact, got an increase in funding. But I'm going to dedicate myself, with all the urgency I've dedicated myself to this fight, to seeing that in the 2030s and beyond, there are no Medicaid cuts that take effect in Missouri.
Crystal Lyon, the St. Charles County mom with a child on Medicaid, is not impressed with Hawley's decision-making. She says she strongly supports the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, known as RECA. That law provides health care and financial assistance to people who develop certain illnesses because of radioactive waste exposure. But she contends the potential damage to Medicaid isn't worth it.
I am all for giving the RECA victims funding. I think that is wonderful. They deserve it. But I think that standing in front of people and justifying it that way is very sad. Because it's not just like he wants to say the able-bodied people that are playing video games in their mother's basement. It's kids like my daughter. It's those RECA victims that are probably on Medicare and Medicaid who need hospitals and they need health care. And I just think that it's sad that our senator can do that to us.
There's still time for lawmakers like Holly to reverse some of the more contentious aspects of the big, beautiful bill. But there's little question what lawmakers ended up passing will affect how low-income workers access health care. And joining us now to break down the One Big Beautiful Bill's impact on Medicaid is Sarah Fentem, who covers health care for St. Louis Public Radio. Sarah, welcome.
Hello.
Before we dive deep into the weed of these complex policy issues, what did you think of Crystal Lyon's sentiments about the Big Beautiful Bill's Medicaid provisions?
Two things really stick out to me, which is she's talking about her child. And as we heard in the top of the show, something like half of Missouri Medicaid recipients, there are 1.2 million of them here, are children. And the second thing I'm listening to her is she's talking about how there's this conception of people on Medicaid as moochers and people who are too lazy to work. And you know, it's a big country and a ton of people are on Medicaid. I'm sure there are people that are like playing video games and receiving benefits. But when you look at the big picture data, it shows that's a very small piece of the Medicaid pie. Something like 10% of people on Medicaid are actually just not working for a reason other than, you know, caregiving, or they're trying to find work, or they're injured or that kind of thing. And so the vast majority of Medicaid recipients are actually working.
We need to take a quick break, but we'll continue our conversation with St. Louis Public Radio's Sarah Fentem about how the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill will affect Missouri's Medicaid program. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Merzenbaum. We're continuing our conversation with St. Louis Public Radio's Sarah Fentem on the future of Missouri's Medicaid program after the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill. And I wanted to focus more on Missouri Senator Josh Hawley, who we heard from earlier in the program. Before voting yes on the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill, Hawley criticized Republicans who wanted to make deep Medicaid cuts, but ended up voting for a measure that could eventually prompt states to rein in their programs. New York Times columnist Frank Bruni wrote that this week that Hawley's vote for the Big Beautiful Bill continues, quote, the arc of Republican lawmakers in the Trump era bending toward complete submission. Sarah, I understand that you spoke with the senator this week. What did he tell you about why he ended up voting for the One Big Beautiful Bill?
Yeah, as you said, he was a no, and then he was a yes. And Senator Hawley mentioned an amendment that adds an estimated $1 billion for rural Missouri hospitals to offset losses they could face. That's called the Rural Hospital Transformation Fund.
We were able in this bill to delay any changes to rural hospital funding, and not just that, but to get an increase in rural hospital funding over the next 4 years. That's $1 billion for Missouri's rural hospitals, and they need that money right now. So I'm glad we'll be getting that money. I think that's going to be very helpful over the next 4 years. And that gives me time and others who are like-minded time to make sure that any future cuts do not go into effect. I'm opposed to cutting funding for rural hospitals. I'm opposed to Medicaid benefit cuts, of which there are none in this bill. So make no mistake, I'm going to fight any changes regarding rural hospital funding in the future. I want to make sure that no cuts to rural hospitals ever go into effect for Missouri or frankly any other state.
Now, when Holly says there's no Medicaid benefit cuts in this bill, I suppose that's true in the sense that it doesn't reduce what the Medicaid program will actually provide to enrollees. But isn't it possible that fewer people will have access to Medicaid when this bill goes into effect?
That's what people are saying. So a big thing the bill does is it adds a lot of documentation and eligibility requirements to Medicaid. A lot of people who have been following this bill have heard about work requirements for people between 19 and 64. And states will soon have to verify patients' eligibility for Medicaid more often, twice a year instead of once a year. And so what that does is not only limit who's eligible, but it requires a lot of verification and documentation, states going back and forth with Medicaid recipients. And we've seen in the past, that's where a lot of people actually drop off, not necessarily because they're not eligible to receive benefits, but because their address hasn't been updated or they don't fill out a form correctly. Applying for these benefits can be a lot of work and a lot of paperwork and a lot of bureaucratic wrangling and navigation. And so, make one mistake or you miss a deadline and you're off the rolls. And we've seen that in the past. And that could eventually end up dropping a lot of people off the rolls, whether they're eligible or not.
Crystal Lyon, the St. Charles County mom whose daughter benefited from Medicaid paid health care, said that it wasn't worth it to vote for the One Big Beautiful Bill just because it had a program to help people who became sick because of radioactive waste exposure. You actually asked Holly basically that exact question. What did he say?
Yeah, why did you vote for something that eventually you'll have to reverse in the future? And he said he's really focused on making sure these cuts don't happen. They have a few years before they go into effect, and he's really focused on making sure that in that time he fights to make sure that they don't actually get cut.
Yeah, well, we were able to ensure that there are no Medicaid benefit cuts in this bill whatsoever, which was a red line for me. And this bill does not change the federal government's contribution to Medicaid for Missouri or any other state, which is outstanding. We were able to delay any changes to the rural hospital funding. In fact, we were able to get an increase for rural hospitals in Missouri of $1 billion over the next 4 years. And my view is that that's pretty good, and RECA is of the highest importance. But I'll tell you, when it comes to Medicaid, I'm opposed to cutting Medicaid funding for rural hospitals. Missouri's going to see an increase in rural hospital funding over the next 4 years, but I am committed to ensuring that there are no future cuts to Medicaid rural hospitals. I know many of my colleagues want that. Many of them proposed it. Many of them want to see the prospective cuts in this bill go into effect. I do not. So I will be doing everything I can to ensure that rural hospitals are not cut, that their funding is not cut, and that there are no Medicaid benefit cuts in Missouri going forward.
So I cannot read Josh Hawley's mind, but what he's talking about there almost certainly is a number of his Republican colleagues are very critical of medical provider taxes, which are taxes on places like hospitals and pharmacies that help states pay for Medicaid. For instance, Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina called them a scam that allows states to bilk the federal government out of more money. And Idaho Senator Mike Crapo called it a funding gimmick. Did Hawley find any validity in his colleagues' opinions?
Yeah, I asked him about that, and the answer is no. He thinks it's baloney.
I mean, my view is that this is a way that the states have legally and totally above board chosen to fund their contribution to Medicaid. I mean, listen, what would they prefer? I mean, my colleagues who say they don't like this, would they prefer that homeowners be taxed more? Would they prefer that we have higher energy taxes? I mean, how do they want to raise the money? I just think that this is a silly argument. The truth is the states have been using provider taxes for years, and the bottom line is this: we should not be cutting funding for rural hospitals, period. We should not be doing it. It is a mistake. It is the wrong thing to do, and that's why I emphasize Missouri is going to see an increase in funding for rural hospitals over the next 4 years, and that will give us time to stop any future cuts going forward. I'm totally opposed to cutting funding for rural hospitals.
Now, we've heard Hawley talk multiple times about the increase in funding for rural hospitals, and that is a clear reference to this $50 billion fund that was added when the Senate was passing the Big Beautiful Bill. What exactly will this money go to, and do the people you talk to feel like it will be worth it, especially with these potentially stark medical provider tax cuts?
Right. This was something that was written into the bill in the final days that it was going back and forth in D.C. And it's a $50 billion something called the Rural Hospital. I forget what H word it is, but it's a $50 billion fund that's going to all 50 states to help offset these potential losses that they're going to see. And so, as we've heard Holly say on the program today, that is an estimated about $1 billion for Missouri. And so I asked Heidi Lucas, who we heard earlier, about this, and she's, $1 billion is a lot of money, but hospitals also cost a lot of money. And so when you're looking at $1 billion over a few years for rural hospitals, how much does that actually do? And I asked Holly, I said, okay, what happens after 2030 when this fund runs out? And it was very like, well, we'll keep the cuts from going into effect. And so the question is, $1 billion is great, especially for rural hospitals, but is it enough to offset these losses, especially if it doesn't end up, if people aren't successful in keeping these other cuts from going into effect? What she said is just basically is kicking the inevitable down the road.
Now, we've talked a lot about how Missouri and other states could face a lot of financial hardship because of the medical provider tax restrictions. The Missouri Hospital Association says it could cost the state hundreds of millions of dollars if they fully go into effect by 2032. But Robert Kasner, a research professor at the University of Chicago, is not terribly sympathetic to this argument, especially given states like Missouri have done since the COVID-19 pandemic.
The largesse that came out of the pandemic payments have been long lasting for states. And most states have been cutting taxes, right? So the states have the taxing potential. It's not like they've been raising taxes. They've been cutting taxes on average. Their budgets are looking good. The federal government has been supporting them generously for the last several years. So I also think states are in a little better position now, especially with the long runway they've been given again, to put their Medicaid and state budgets on a better footing, more transparent for sure.
That was Robert Kasner, a research professor at the University of Chicago, talking about some of the financial impact of the One Big Beautiful Bill. Sarah, does Robert have a point there? I mean, Missouri has cut taxes a couple of times since the pandemic when they got all this money. Isn't it kind of a self-inflicted wound that they may be dealing with some of these hardships going forward?
I think, like, as a health reporter, the pandemic has been really complicated when it comes to looking at how all of this funding ends up shaking out, because a lot of this is sort of like one-time payments, right? And so when you look at those one-time payments, how hardy is that funding for different, state activities? Like it's not a continuing source of help.
Now, Holly said multiple times throughout your interview that he would try to prevent things like the medical provider tax curves from going into effect. And he's not alone in wanting that. Missouri Governor Mike Kehoe also wants Congress to reverse course.
In Missouri, we've handled it very responsibly, as you've seen. We've had the percentage go up and down, so to only use what we need. And I'm a fan of that model. I think we've used it effectively, and credit to our hospital and our hospital association. They've really done a good job of making sure we don't take advantage of it. We use it to fit Missourians the best.
That was Missouri Governor Mike Kehoe talking about why he supports medical provider taxes. Now, Sarah, I've heard politicians say forever that after something they don't like passes, that they're going to work really hard to reverse it. How many times have you heard from Republicans saying they were going to reverse the Affordable Care Act in the last 15 years?
Right.
Are Missouri Republicans engaging in wishful thinking here, or do you think that it is possible to reverse course, especially if there's a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president in 2029 or something?
I think, as we saw with the passage of this bill, and all of the compromising and the arm twisting and the wrangling that you had to get through to get this particular one even, rammed through Congress, it's hard to get past any big reforms like this. And And then I feel like it's even harder to repeal stuff once it's actually in place. And so I think it's a question of sort of putting the toothpaste back in the tube. Can you do it? Maybe. Is it going to be messy and a lot of work? Yes.
It is often very messy to put toothpaste back in tubes.
Yes.
But on that note, Sarah Fentem is St. Louis Public Radio's health reporter. Sarah, thank you so much for being here today.
Anytime.
Today's episode was produced by Jason Rosenbaum.
Our audio engineer is Aaron Dorr. This podcast was mixed and edited by Aaron.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.